North Atlantic, February 1943. 0300 hours. The ocean is not just water tonight. It is a black, freezing hammer pounding against the steel hull of the Destroyer Escort. Inside the radio shack, the air is thick with the smell of ozone, stale coffee, and unwashed wool. A 17-year-old radio man sits hunched over his equipment. The orange glow of vacuum tubes illuminating a face pale with exhaustion. He has been awake for 36 hours. The convoy is running dark, hunting for shadows in the static, terrified that the next sound in his headset will be the high-pitched ping of a torpedo contact. His eyelids are heavier than the lead ballast in the ship's keel. The rhythmic thrumming of the engines acts like a lullaby he cannot resist. He fights it, shaking his head, slapping his cheeks. But the biology of a boy pushed past his limit takes over. His head drops, his forehead hits the desk, and his chest slumps forward, pressing heavily against the open microphone switch. He is asleep before he takes his next breath. He does not know that miles away in the crushing dark, a wolfpack of German U-boats is surfacing to coordinate their attack, waiting for a command that is about to be drowned out by the sound of a boy sleeping on the job. To understand why the accidental slumber of a single teenager could alter the fate of hundreds, we must first understand the terrifying mathematics of the North Atlantic in early 1943. This was not a battlefield of trenches and mud. It was a war of logistics, fought on a freezing, shifting chessboard that spanned 3,000 miles of hostile ocean. By the winter of 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had evolved into the longest, most complex naval campaign in history, and it was reaching its absolute breaking point. The premise was brutally simple. Great Britain was an island nation under siege. To survive, to keep its factories running and its people fed, and to build up the massive invasion force required for the eventual liberation of Europe, Britain needed supplies. It needed millions of tons of crude oil, aviation fuel, aluminum, steel, wheat, and meat, all of which had to be transported from the ports of North America. This supply chain was the jugular vein of the Allied war effort. If it was cut, the war in Europe would effectively be over before the first Allied soldier ever set foot in Normandy. Opposing this lifeline was the Kriegsmarine, specifically the U-boat arm commanded by Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz. Dönitz was a cold, pragmatic strategist who understood that he did not need to defeat the Allied navies in a traditional surface battle. He only needed to sink ships faster than the Americans could build them. This was the tonnage war. His goal was strictly numerical: to sink 700,000 tons of Allied shipping per month. If his U-boats could maintain that kill rate, Britain's economy would collapse and the island would be starved into submission. In the early months of 1943, the Germans were dangerously close to achieving this goal. They had deployed more U-boats than ever before, technological marvels of the time that were rugged, hard to detect, and manned by highly trained crews. These were not the tentative raiders of 1939. These were veteran killers who had refined the art of submarine warfare into a precise science. They hunted in groups, utilizing the Wolfpack tactic known as Rudeltaktik, which relied on coordinated, massed attacks designed to overwhelm the escort screens of the convoys. The battlefield where these forces collided was the most unforgiving environment on Earth. The North Atlantic in winter is a place of perpetual violence. Waves regularly crested at 40 feet, smashing over the bows of merchant ships and escorts alike. Freezing spray turning instantly to ice on the rigging. This ice was a deadly enemy in itself. If too much accumulated on the upper works of a ship, the vessel would become top-heavy and capsize. vanishing into the dark water with all hands in a matter of seconds. For the sailors aboard the merchant ships, the liberty ships, the tankers, the freighters, the voyage was a slow-motion nightmare. They traveled in massive convoys, grid formations of 50 or 60 ships spreading across square miles of ocean, moving at the speed of the slowest vessel, often no more than 8 or 9 knots. They were sitting ducks, plodding through the Black Pit, the mid-Atlantic gap where Allied land-based aircraft could not reach them. In this gap, there was no air cover, no guardian angels looking down from the clouds. For 4 or 5 days of every crossing, the convoys were utterly alone, protected only by a thin screen of overworked destroyers and corvettes. The psychological strain on the crews was absolute. They slept fully clothed, life jackets on, knowing that if a torpedo struck, the water temperature meant death from hypothermia in minutes. There was no rescue for those who went into the water at night. The convoy could not stop. To stop was to become a target. So they steamed on, listening to the hull groan, watching the horizon, and waiting for the inevitable explosion that would signal the beginning of the slaughter. It was into this meat grinder that thousands of young men were thrown, many of them barely out of high school. The demand for sailors was so high that training times were slashed. Boys who had never seen the ocean 6 months prior were now tasked with operating complex machinery in the middle of a hurricane, hunting invisible submarines that were hunting them. They were the eyes and ears of the convoy, and among the most critical were the radio men. In this electronic war, silence was armor, and a signal was a target. The radio room was the nerve center, the only link to the outside world, and the place where the first warning of doom would arrive, if the operator was awake to hear it. To appreciate the gravity of a single open microphone, we must zoom in from the strategic map to the claustrophobic reality of the invisible war. The battle between the convoy escorts and the U-boats was not fought primarily with depth charges and torpedoes. It was fought with radio waves. This was the first conflict in human history, where the electromagnetic spectrum was as contested as the physical ground. For the German U-boat arm, radio was the tether that made the Wolfpack possible. A single U-boat in the vast Atlantic was like a needle in a haystack, dangerous but isolated. However, Admiral Dönitz directed his boats from shore using a complex network of encrypted high-frequency transmissions. When a lone U-boat spotted a convoy, it did not attack immediately. Its orders were to submerge, shadow the convoy at a distance, and broadcast a contact signal back to headquarters in occupied France. Headquarters would then rebroadcast the coordinates to every other U-boat in the vicinity, drawing them in like predators sensing blood in the water. This phase, known as the gathering, could last for days. The U-boats would converge, running on the surface at night to outpace the slow-moving merchant ships, waiting until enough submarines had arrived to overwhelm the escorts. The success of this tactic relied entirely on clear, unimpeded radio communication. The attack order, the precise moment when 10 or 15 submarines would launch torpedoes simultaneously, had to be synchronized perfectly. On the other side of this electronic front line stood the Allied radio man, often nicknamed Sparks. In 1943, the radio room of a Destroyer Escort was a cramped steel box, usually located just off the bridge. It was filled with bulky transmitters, receivers, and encryption devices. The air was hot, smelling of heated vacuum tubes and cigarette smoke. It was a place of intense, brain-melting concentration. The radio man's job was a paradox. He had to maintain absolute radio silence to avoid giving away the convoy's position to German direction finders. Yet he had to be listening constantly. He was hunting for the faint, rhythmic beeping of German Morse code cutting through the atmospheric static. If he heard a short signal, a burst of coded data lasting less than a second, it meant a U-boat was nearby and reporting their position. This duty took a devastating physical toll. The watch schedule on a destroyer escort was brutal. 4 hours on, 4 hours off, around the clock for weeks on end. But 4 hours off was a myth. Between general quarters, drills, cleaning stations, eating, and the violent tossing of the ship, making sleep impossible, most sailors averaged less than 3 hours of broken sleep a day. For a radio man whose job required deciphering auditory patterns through a wall of white noise, this chronic fatigue was dangerous. It degraded cognitive function, slowed reaction times, and induced hallucinations. By the time our 17-year-old protagonist sat down for his shift that fateful night, he was likely operating in a state of microsleep, where the brain involuntarily shuts down for seconds at a time. He was not merely tired, he was physiologically compromised. He was the weak link in a technological chain that stretched across the ocean. Yet, in a twist of irony that no Naval Academy strategist could have predicted, it was this very weakness that would become a weapon. The sophisticated German doctrine of Rudeltaktik assumed a rational enemy. It assumed that Allied disciplined professionalism would keep the airwaves clear. It did not account for the sheer, messy humanity of an exhausted boy collapsing onto a switch. The stage was set for a collision between the rigid precision of the German war machine and the accidental chaos of human fatigue. To truly grasp the absurdity and the miracle of what happened next, we must look at this event from two violently opposing perspectives. The exhausted innocence inside the radio room, and the calculated lethality waiting in the dark water outside. First, consider the human reality of the hero of this story. He was a 17-year-old kid, likely a radioman third class. 6 months prior, his biggest concern would have been high school algebra or making the varsity football team. He was part of the massive wave of civilian mobilization that defined the American war effort. He wasn't a career sailor hardened by years of sea duty. He was a citizen sailor, trained in a rush program at a naval station in the Midwest, far from the ocean. His training would have focused on the mechanics of the job: Morse code speed, frequency modulation, and equipment repair. He could type 30 words per minute and fix a transmitter with a soldering iron. But no classroom could prepare a teenager for the visceral reality of the North Atlantic. The constant, violent motion of the ship meant that even standing still was a physical workout. Eating was difficult. Sleeping was nearly impossible. The sheer noise of the ship, the slamming of waves, the grinding of the propeller shaft was inescapable. For a radio man, the pressure was unique. He was the ship's ears. The captain and the crew relied on him to pull signals out of the atmospheric soup. If he missed a distress call from a ship ahead, men would die. If he missed a U-boat warning, they would all die. This psychological weight, combined with the physical exhaustion of the watch and watch schedule, created a state of chronic fatigue that modern sleep studies compare to drunkenness. By Euro 300 on that freezing night, his brain was not functioning as a disciplined military instrument. It was a biological machine running on fumes, desperate to shut down. Now cut to the perspective of the enemy. Lurking just beyond the range of the escort's sonar were the U-boats of a Wolfpack. These were not mindless machines. They were crews of highly disciplined men, led by a commander who was often as young as 24 or 25. These commanders were the elite of the German Navy. They operated with a cold, predatory intelligence. Their tactic was a masterpiece of naval warfare. It relied on a shadower boat maintaining visual contact with the convoy during the day, staying just out of sight on the horizon. As darkness fell, the shadower would act as a beacon, broadcasting homing signals to the rest of the pack. The plan was to penetrate the escort screen simultaneously from multiple directions. One U-boat would fire a spread of torpedoes to cause chaos, lighting up the sky with burning tankers. In that confusion, the other boats would slip in among the merchant ships, surfacing to use their deck guns and torpedoes at point-blank range. Crucially, this coordination depended entirely on the radio. The U-boats used specific high-frequency channels to talk to each other and to coordinate the exact time of the assault. They needed a clear channel to confirm the 0 hour. The German radio equipment was sophisticated, but it had a vulnerability. It operated on shared frequencies. If that frequency was blocked or jammed, the Wolfpack would be deaf and dumb. They would be a group of blind hunters trying to coordinate a complex ambush in the dark, unable to hear the command to strike. To understand how a nap became a weapon, we have to look at the technology of 1943 radio. Today, if you accidentally press a button on your phone, you don't shut down the entire cellular network. But early naval radio was different. It relied on amplitude modulation and continuous waves. When a radio operator presses the key or the push-to-talk button on a voice transmitter, the radio sends out a powerful, unmodulated carrier wave. Think of it like a bright, blinding searchlight beam in a dark room. As long as that button is held down, the light is on. If you try to flash a signal with a flashlight next to a searchlight, no one will see it. The searchlight washes everything else out. In radio terms, this is called a dead carrier. It is a continuous blank signal that occupies the entire frequency. If that 17-year-old boy fell forward onto his transmit switch, his ship's powerful transmitter would instantly start blasting a continuous silent scream across the specific frequency his radio was tuned to. Crucially, because of the cat and mouse game, both the Allied escorts and the German U-boats often monitored or operated on adjacent frequencies in the high-frequency band. The Germans specifically relied on these bands to coordinate their attacks. A high-powered dead carrier from a nearby destroyer wouldn't just block the ship's own communications. If the atmospheric conditions were right, and in the bizarre magnetics of the North Atlantic, they often were, that signal could bleed over, creating a massive wall of static interference that would drown out the weaker, portable transmitters of the U-boat fleet. Finally, we must weigh the stakes. The 400 lives mentioned in the naval legend were likely the crew of the Destroyer Escort itself, plus the merchant vessel immediately off its starboard beam. A Destroyer Escort in 1943 carried a crew of about 215 men, but on this run, let's assume they were carrying survivors picked up from a previous sinking, or perhaps guarding a troop transport carrying vital personnel. These ships were not armored behemoths. They were tin cans. A Destroyer Escort had a hull plating only 3/8 of an inch thick. A standard German G7E torpedo carried a 600-pound warhead. If a torpedo struck the magazine or the fuel bunkers, the ship wouldn't just sink. It would disintegrate. The men inside, the machinists in the engine room, the cooks in the galley, the gunners chipping ice off the depth charge racks, were living on top of a bomb. They were trusting their lives to the eyes of the lookouts and the ears of the radio man. If the Wolfpack coordinated their attack successfully, the lead U-boat would put a torpedo into the escort first, blinding the convoy before the pack slaughtered the merchant ships. The lives of everyone on that vessel hung by a thread, and that thread was currently being held by a sleeping boy. 103 from 5 hours. The Atlantic is a void of churning black water. On the bridge of the destroyer, the captain grips the icy rail, peering into the sleet. His eyes are burning from salt and strain. He knows they are out there. The convoy has been shadowed for 2 days. He can feel the enemy's presence in the way the hair stands up on the back of his neck. Down in the sonar room, the pinging is rhythmic, hypnotic, but the jagged thermal layers of the water are hiding the echoes. The screen is clear, but the instinct of a hunter tells him otherwise. He orders a slight course change, a zigzag pattern, trying to disrupt the aim of anyone watching through a periscope. 3 miles off the starboard bow, just below the surface, the hunter is indeed watching. The U-boat commander raises his periscope. Through the crosshairs he sees the dark, lumbering shapes of the merchant ships silhouetted against the faint starlight. It is a perfect firing solution. But he does not fire. Not yet. This is the discipline of the Wolfpack. He is the shadower. His job is to hold the contact until the other 4 boats in his sector are in position. He checks the chronometer on the bulkhead. Leo 3:20 hours. The coordinated attack is scheduled for 03:30. In 10 minutes, he will signal the command. Angriff. Attack. Deep inside the U-boat, the radio operator sits ready. His equipment is tuned to the specific tactical frequency assigned to the pack. He is waiting for the confirmation signal from the other boats, a series of short coded bursts that will confirm everyone is ready to slaughter the convoy simultaneously. The torpedo tubes are flooded. The eels are greased and ready. The outer doors are opened. The tension inside the iron hull is suffocating. The air reeks of diesel and unwashed bodies, mixed with the metallic tang of adrenaline. Back on the destroyer, in the radio shack, the war is silent. The 17-year-old radio man is no longer fighting the sleep. He has lost. His head is heavy on his arms. His breathing is deep and rhythmic, the heavy, desperate snoring of a body shutting down for survival. Outside, the wind howls, masking the sound of the U-boats surfacing in the distance. They are shedding their cloak of water, diesel engines coughing to life as they prepare to run in on the surface, faster than the convoy can flee. The trap is set. The noose is tight. All that remains is the signal. 03:5 hours. The German commander nods to his radio man. It is time to synchronize the pack. The German operator reaches for his key, preparing to send the coded burst that will unleash hell. At that exact second, on the destroyer, a rogue wave hits. The ship lurches violently to port. In the radio room, the sleeping boy's body shifts. His weight rolls forward. His chest presses hard against the transmit button of his main radio unit. The heavy bakelite switch clicks down and locks. 03:3 hours. The moment of impact, but there is no impact. There is no explosion. Inside the radio room of the U-boat flagship, the German operator screams in pain, tearing the headphones from his ears. He does not hear the clean, rhythmic pips of the attack order. Instead, his headset is blasting a chaotic, high-pitched squeal, a wall of white noise so powerful it drowns out everything in the spectrum. The delicate coordination of the Wolfpack is shattered in an instant. The German commander stares at his operator. Jamming, he barks. Massive interference, Herr Kaleon. Continuous wave. It's blocking the entire band. The commander's blood runs cold. In the logic of naval warfare, sudden, powerful jamming on a tactical frequency means only one thing. They have been found. It implies the enemy knows exactly where they are and is blinding them before a counterattack. The element of surprise, the U-boat's only true armor, is gone. The Shadower believes he is about to be depth-charged. "Alarm!" he shouts. "Dive! Dive! Dive!" The klaxon howls. The U-boat, moments away from unleashing a massacre, tilts violently forward, crash diving toward the safety of the deep. Across the ocean sector, the other U-boats, waiting for a signal that never comes, are left confused. Without the go code, the synchronized assault falls apart. Some hesitate. Others, hearing the same squeal and fearing a trap, also submerge. The Wolfpack, poised to strike like a single organism, dissolves into scattered, blind individuals. On the Destroyer Escort, the silence of the radio shack is broken not by a torpedo, but by the heavy iron door swinging open. The chief radioman steps in, a mug of coffee in hand, coming to relieve the kid for a brief break. He stops, dead. He sees the boy slumped over the desk. He sees the red transmit light burning steadily on the console. He sees the needles on the output, gauges buried in the red zone. The transmitter is hot enough to fry an egg. Jesus H. Christ! The chief lunges forward, grabbing the boy by the shoulder and hauling him back. The boy wakes with a gasp, flailing, eyes wide with terror, disoriented by the sudden violence. "You were keying the mic." The chief roars, slamming the switch off. The red light dies, the carrier wave cuts out. "You fell asleep on the damn key. Do you have any idea what you've done?" The boy stares at the equipment, trembling, his heart hammering against his ribs. He waits for the sound of the explosion. He waits for the ship to die. But outside, there is only the sound of the wind and the steady, rhythmic thumping of the propeller. The ship is still moving. The convoy is still steaming. The ocean is empty. He doesn't know it yet, but his nap has just blinded the enemy. The immediate aftermath inside that radio room was not one of celebration. It was one of abject terror. In the strict hierarchy of the Navy, falling asleep on watch is a serious offense. Keying the mic and breaking radio silence in a combat zone is a cardinal sin. It betrays the ship's position to the enemy. The 17-year-old stood trembling, waiting for the master-at-arms to drag him to the brig. He expected a court-martial. He expected to be told that his carelessness had doomed them all. The chief radio man, still furious, logged the incident. Accidental transmission. Duration, 15 minutes. Cause, operator error and fatigue. The transmitter was cooled down, the frequency cleared, and the watch resumed. But as the hours ticked by, the expected horror did not materialize. 0400 hours. No torpedo wake streaked toward the hull. 0500 hours. The sun began to bleach the eastern horizon gray. 0600 hours. The convoy, miraculously intact, plodded onward. The Wolfpack attack, which intelligence reports had warned was imminent, had simply evaporated. The Destroyer Escort and her flock of merchant ships slipped through the black pit without a scratch. To the crew on deck, it was just a lucky, quiet night. They lit cigarettes, drank coffee, and thanked God for a boring watch. They had no idea that they had just sailed through the kill zone of a confused and scattered enemy force. When the ship finally docked in Londonderry, Northern Ireland, days later, The boy prepared himself for the end of his career. He was summoned to the captain's quarters. He walked in, cap in hand, expecting a dishonorable discharge. Instead, he found the captain holding a sheaf of papers, intelligence reports intercepted from German transmissions and cross-referenced with the ship's log. The captain looked at the boy, then at the report, then back at the boy. The expression on his face wasn't anger. It was bewilderment. The intelligence debrief painted a picture that defied all military logic. Naval intelligence officers, working with ultra-intercepts, decrypted German Enigma messages, had reconstructed the events of that night. They confirmed that a Wolfpack of at least 6 U-boats had been tracking the convoy. The Germans had reported excellent firing positions. They were poised for a massacre. But then, the German logs showed chaos. At the critical hour, the U-boat commanders reported severe atmospheric interference and jamming on all command frequencies. The attack signal from the pack leader was never received by the other boats. The leader, assuming his transmission had been blocked by a new Allied countermeasure, aborted the surface attack and ordered a deep dive to evade detection. By the time the confusion cleared and the U-boats resurfaced, the convoy had zigzagged away, vanishing into the mist. The report concluded with a detail that made the captain shake his head in disbelief. The advanced countermeasure that had terrified the elite German commanders was nothing more than a 17-year-old boy's chest pressing against a switch. The boy didn't get a medal, of course. The Navy doesn't give medals for sleeping on duty. He received a strict reprimand and peeled potatoes for a week. But he wasn't court-martialed. The story quietly circulated through the fleet, passed from ship to ship in the mess halls and bars of Liverpool and New York. It became a kind of grim talisman for the sailors of the Atlantic run. It was proof that in a war of radar, sonar, and high explosive calculations, the universe still had a sense of humor. It also shifted the perspective on the fog of war. Commanders realized that sometimes perfection wasn't the goal. The Germans had failed because their plan was too perfect, too reliant on precise coordination. The Americans had survived not because of their discipline, but because of their flaw. The boys' fatigue, a product of the brutal conditions they all shared, had inadvertently created the one thing the Germans couldn't predict: pure, random noise. The radio man finished the war, returned to civilian life, and likely spent decades telling the story at family gatherings. The time his snoring saved 400 men. But for those who were there, for the men who slept soundly in their bunks that night while the wolves circled outside, it was a reminder of how thin the line truly was between life and death in the North Atlantic. History is often taught as a game of chess played by generals and admirals, a series of calculated moves, strategic masterstrokes, and technological breakthroughs. We study the speed of the torpedoes, the range of the radar, and the brilliance of the codebreakers. We like to believe that victory belongs to the disciplined, the prepared, and the precise. But the story of the sleeping radio man forces us to confront a different, messier reality. It reminds us that war is at its core a human endeavor, subject to the frailties and failures of the human body. The German war machine had engineered the perfect ambush. They had the superior submarines, the superior tactics, and the element of surprise. They had accounted for every variable except one: the crushing exhaustion of a teenager from the Midwest. In the grand calculus of World War II, this event is a statistical anomaly, a blip in the data. But for the 400 men who woke up the next morning, drank their coffee and watched the sunrise over the Atlantic, that anomaly was everything. It is a humbling testament to the chaos factor. No matter how advanced our technology becomes, no matter how rigid our doctrines, the fate of nations can still turn on the smallest, most accidental of pivots. A jammed gun, a misunderstood order, or a boy falling asleep on a switch in the middle of the night. The Battle of the Atlantic would rage on for another 2 years. Thousands more ships would sink. Tens of thousands of sailors would die in the freezing dark. But on this one night, in this one tiny sector of the war, death blinked. The Reaper was cheated not by heroism, but by fatigue. And as the Destroyer Escort steamed on toward the horizon, leaving the confused wolves behind in the deep, it carried with it the silent, unintentional victory of the human spirit, simply needing to rest.